Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, December 2nd, and Colonel Jack Baud is here with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me again. Thank you to be back on your channel.
Let's get started with what's going on in the West Asia. We had a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, and right after this ceasefire, we had this re- re- rebels, Syrian rebels, the so-called Syrian rebels against Bashar al-Assad government in Syria. Before this happening, we had a ceasefire in 2020, a ceasefire agreement between the Syrian government and these rebels, which was violated recently, as I've mentioned. And on the other hand, we had an agreement between Iran, Russia, and Turkey that these countries designated Aleppo and Idlib as demilitarized zone. And right now, it's all gone. What's going on in Syria, in your opinion?
Well, I think we have to go back to what happened in 2016. You remember that at that time you had the battle for Aleppo that was quite heavy, and this battle ended up with the idea of that was brought by the Russians, by the way, to have those de-escalation zones. And you had, in fact, two or three de-escalation zones that were defined in Syria, and one was in close to Dara, close to the Israeli border on the south, and another one was in the area of Hama, um, a small town that is between Damascus and Aleppo. You had a very small de-escalation zone in the east of Damascus, and you had a very large one in the region of Idlib. The region, maybe I have a map here to show that, because it's probably important to visualize this. And here we go. Here you have those de-escalation zones. So down in the south in Dara, close to Damascus here, Hama here, and in the north in the region of Idlib. And now we have this attack coming from this region. Now, what were those de escalation zones? The idea was, after the Battle of Aleppo, that it was the idea of making discriminating or separating the moderate opposition and the extremist opposition, so to say, and to have these those who don't want to enter, let's say, uh, um, a normal, let's put it that way, a normal opposition process, they would have to go in those de-escalation zone. And after the Battle of Aleppo, and I remember experts in France saying that in Aleppo you had only moderate, it was civil society opposition and all that. But when this idea of the escalation zone came, uh, all all the armored groups in Aleppo chosen to join two extremist group who were considered as jihadi group, and namely the Hayat Tahrir al-Shams and the Arar al-Shams, which are the two main, and still today, the two main Islamist groups, both affiliated to Al Qaeda. The Hayat Tahrir al Shams, HTS in short, are is even on the terrorist list of many countries, including the US, by the way. But this group made its way to the Idlib region, and this in this province you had those groups stationed or located there under the guarantee of Turkey, so that you would not have, let's say, a battle on from both sides. So we know that the opposition that we had in 2011 up to 2016 17, these de escalation zones were established in 2017. Um, in those 6 years or so, you had definitely a an opposition that was strongly based on jihadi groups. There is no such thing as a moderate opposition in Syria, and that I think is important to understand, because in the West we portrayed the opposition as a moderate one, including the famous Syrian, the Free Syrian Army, that was considered for a while as, I mean, it's still considered, by the way, as by the West as a democratic force, but in reality, this army is, in fact, was created back in Turkey by the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood was expelled from Syria in the early 80s by Hafez al Assad, the father of Bashar al Assad. And this Muslim Brotherhood, or these Muslim brothers, or I don't know how to call them, they regrouped in Turkey and they created there a kind of opposition movement in exile, so to say. And as soon as the troubles to uh, started in Syria in 2011, and by the way, they started in the region of Daraa, which is close to the Israeli border. And I know from one of my former colleagues who used to be in Israeli intelligence, Israel was not so, let's say, Israel was involved in those in this. Let's put it that way. They managed to instigate those troubles that started and later reached the whole Syria. So that was back in 2011. So we had those extremists already there, and the they were strongly supported by the Israeli and the West. And by the way, still today, again, I don't know what the role of Turkey exactly is, but there are several reports that tend to confirm that you have Ukrainian intelligence, US intelligence, and French intelligence involved in instigating this attack against the Syria government. So I don't know exactly. I think it's probably too early to assess what is right, what is true, and what is not. But based on what we have seen in the last couple of months, I would suggest that the Western influence in this conflict is quite high. First, we had already back in June, we had reports that the Ukrainian intelligence is trying to instigate attacks against Russian presence. I say Russian presence. We could say military or paramilitary forces, because in fact we had a report saying that Ukrainian forces instigated attacks against a Wagner organization in Sudan or in Niger. And we also had reports later this year, I mean, that was even in September, that Ukrainian forces were involved in attacking Russian forces in Syria. So there is obviously here an interest, and that was also on the Ukrainian media, by the way. And probably I can even find here some. Um, Here we go. Sorry. Um, So we have here, even in the Ukrainian press, you had reports that Ukraine tried to extend the war to to Syria. So the war against Russia. So this, and here you see that there's a kind of convergence between two conflicts. The one, as you rightly put before, the one between Israel and Hezbollah, but you have also another conflict that is related to that. This is the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, because Russia obviously supports the Syrian government. And now we see a convergence of interest between the Ukrainians and the Israelis. And that is probably one of the possible explanation of why this happened right now. Because in both countries, I mean, Ukraine and Israel, you have you have definitely a situation where both countries are in the process of losing a war. And in fact, the fact that Israel asked for a ceasefire in South Lebanon indicates that the Israel was in difficulty and not the Hezbollah. I think it's important to understand. I mean, the Israelis always rejected any idea of of negotiation with Hezbollah because, first of all, they consider Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, and therefore you don't negotiate with them. So the fact that Israel asked for a ceasefire shows that Israel was obviously in difficulty there, in a situation of weakness. And we have exactly the same situation in Ukraine. And with this nearing uh, um, presidential mandate of Trump in January, in 1 month and a half, um, we see that Ukraine starts to think about how to get out of this problem, because they don't want to have obviously they don't want to negotiate with Russia on Russia's terms, which we can understand. But in both countries, Ukraine and Israel, they have a problem. So they need to create a problem for A, Russia, and B, its allies. And it's incidentally, Syria is considered by Israel as an ally of Hezbollah. And the point here of weakening Syria is both to weaken the position of Russia and to weaken the position of Hezbollah, because by weakening the or bringing a new war in Syria would contribute to prevent the resupply of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has suffered quite extensively from the Israeli invasion of South Lebanon. It suffered. I mean, we have seen that part of this its leadership has been affected or killed by the Israelis, and there are suddenly a lot of damages and destructions and so on. So Hezbollah needs also some fresh air, if you want. And from the Ukrainian side, they need also to demonstrate the weakness of Russia. And therefore, they need to extend Russia. And we are in the same idea that you had in 2019 when Arestovich explained why Russia must be dragged into a conflict. The idea was to extend Russia and its capabilities, and therefore weakening Russia. And we are probably in the same kind of thinking here today. And that explains probably why we have this attack at this point in time. Now, whether Turkey is actively involved in that process, it's very, I mean, for me at least, hard to say. Uh, to some extent, we can consider that Turkey is involved because Turkey was considered as a guarantor of the forces that were in this Idlib pocket, or this de-escalation zone, and as such, Turkey had a responsibility to maintain a kind of order in that pocket and to prevent any attack against Syria, and it failed to do so. So, in that sense, we can say that Turkey carries a responsibility. But on the other hand, we see that when we talk, if we consider what I just said about the converging interests of Ukraine and Israel, then we see other actors playing in the game, and namely the US and the French. And again, I don't know, and I have in that at that stage no mean to confirm this, but there were several reports mentioning the implication of Ukrainian, US, and French intelligence in instigating this attack from the Islamists, and namely the Hayat Tahrir al-Shams in against Aleppo. Whether it's true or not, again, I have no indication, but it would make sense if we consider the strategic situation of all these actors. They need to have something. They want to. I mean, it's not no mystery that they want to have Bashar al-Assad toppled, and everything seems to boil in that direction, if I can put it that way. So that's how I see things. So it's rather a convergence of interest in geographically against Syria, and timely after the ceasefire and the situation in Ukraine, that may explain what happened just in that period of time.
It's yeah.
Yeah.
Do, it seems that Iran is sending, or Iranian backed forces are going to Syria to help the government in Syria. How do you see, right after the ceasefire, the Israeli government was talking about their focus right now is on Iran. Is that related to what's going on in Syria, or it's something, or it's not that much influenced by that concept? How do you
Well,
see in that direction?
well, I think Iran will always remain in the focus of both Israel and the US. So there is no question on that. The problem is in which priority, because obviously what we have now in northern Israel and South Lebanon, there's a conflict with Hezbollah. And we have seen that the problem Hezbollah poses to Israel is much bigger than anticipated. We see that Hezbollah is a very significant force, able to resist efficiently against Israel. We have seen, on the other hand, that Israel was not able to solve the problem in the Gaza Strip. So we see that Israel, in fact, is a much weaker country than expected or claimed. As a result, there is a first priority for Israel, which is the elimination of its immediate threats, which is Hezbollah and its backyard somehow, which is Syria, obviously. Because the problem for Israel is that by having this kind of aggressive security policy or national security policy, it has antagonized the whole neighborhood, if I can put it that way. So Israel never managed to make good friends. even if they have treaties with, let's say, Egypt or Jordan, these treaties were much more forced by the US than wholeheartedly accepted by those countries. As a result, yes, they are in peace with these Egyptian and the Jordan, but these are not friends really. And if the Jordan could choose, they would certainly side with the Syrians and so on. And I know that from very a good source with the Jordanian forces as an example. And I worked incidentally during my UN time. I worked extensively with Egyptian, Syrian, Jordan officers, and I again, what we see on the map doesn't really reflect what population and even armies really think. The political landscape is very different from what is in the mindset of the people. Therefore, we have the appearance of peace, but it's just an appearance. I mean, and the problem with Israel is that everybody agrees that Israel is the problem. And that's for Israel is a major problem. Therefore, we see that if they try to defeat Hezbollah, certainly Syria will side with Hezbollah, and Iran will side with Syria, and even if we said, and even the Lebanese, because we remember in the early 2000s, as it was the idea of when Syria left Lebanon, it was this idea that Lebanese don't like Syrians and so on. Well, it's probably true to a certain extent because, of course, any citizen of any country wants to have its country free from foreign military presence, and therefore I can understand this mindset. But at the same time, when I talked to Lebanese officers, they had a very different perception. Of course, they didn't want to have Syrians on their own territory, but if they had to choose between Israeli and Syrians, they will definitely side with Syrians. And that's the problem of Israel, because defeating Hezbollah doesn't mean that it has solved its problem. Hezbollah is a very strong armored force, but behind them is still are still these countries such as Syria and of course Iran. So Iran remains the objective, but it's further away, and Iran has shown, let's say, not so much appetite to engage actively in the conflict. I mean, they were forced into it by Israel. They had to restore some kind of, not to restore sovereignty, but to assert their sovereignty, as Israel tried to violate this sovereignty by attacking the consulate in Damascus and Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. So Iranians have to restore that credibility and say, well, we have a sovereignty and we have to protect that sovereignty. But beyond that, I'm not sure that Iran has so much appetite attacking Israel or anybody in the region. This is the kind of wishful thinking of the Israelis because they need an enemy. And therefore, they need to have Iran as an enemy. And they will continue to do so because, again, this is the ultimate goal for the Israelis, is to have a Western implication, I mean, a physical military implication in the region. And therefore, we can expect to have other provocations against the Iranians. But uh, any, I mean, the Iranians at the same time are part of this, who I could say, the Shiite belt, if I can put it that way, that goes from Lebanon to Iran. And that was, in fact, this belt, or I don't know how we could call it, but was in fact reestablished by the US
If I'm not
invasion.
mistaken, it's called Shia Crescent.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the Shia croissant is probably a better expression. But this was, if you noted, um, this croissant was in fact established or re-established by the U.S. invasion of Iraq, because Saddam Hussein, in fact, didn't want to have any religion. I mean, his background is there's some kind of Marxism in the Ba'athist party, and therefore they wanted to have kind of a non-religious type of governance. But as the U.S. came in, and in order to make this regime change in Iraq, they had to use the Shia minority, and therefore they reinstalled the Shia in the power, and therefore you have now it's a full croissant between Tehran and Beirut, and that's I think the Americans didn't notice that before entering Iraq, and they noticed that afterwards, and then they started to be more active against Iran and all that, because they noticed, and it was also it was probably for a while at least perceived as a threat by Saudi Arabia, because suddenly Saudi Arabia was completely surrounded by Shiite forces. And remember that you have a Shiite minority in Saudi Arabia, and this minority, incidentally, is in the areas where you have the most oil and oil fields and all that. So it may have strategic importance for Saudi Arabia. Therefore, this Shiite croissant is or used to be a threat with for Saudi Arabia. So we have this situation that the West, by going from one conflict to another, has in fact created a destabilization of the region. And that's exactly what we are witnessing today. And Syria is a country that is basically peaceful, that had no intention to attack Israel. I mean, apart from the question of the Golan, which is still a Syrian territory, which has been annexed by Israel illegally. And but beside this, you have no significant contentions. So we have here a problem that was completely created by the West, completely created by Israel, by antagonizing all its friends instead of finding arrangement with them. And of course, ultimately, the especially for Israel, the role of Iran is so important. And for Iran, it's important to maintain or to protect those Shia minorities. And what we have today, these jihadi who have attacked um, Syria, I mean, Aleppo region, and so on, these are Sunni militias. And therefore, we are back into a conflict that Iran initially didn't want, and probably not even Saudi Arabia. We have mentioned several times on your channel this rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because both countries don't want to exploit religious differences into political divergence. And I think this is a problem that the West tries to exploit in order to create a kind of a Balkanization. I mean, we are back to a very old, I mean, not very old, it's about 40 years old plan that was designed by Mr. Yinon, who used to be an advisor to Netanyahu in the 80s, and who, in fact, advocated for the Balkanization of the Middle East and to break those large countries into smaller ones that would not be, let's say, adversaries. Or it's not that they would not be adversaries, but they would spend their time fighting against each other instead of having Israel into their focus. So that was the idea: divide et impera, divide and rule. This was the motto of the Romans during in the Roman Empire, and that's exactly what the Israelis tried to do. And that's also the reason why you have all these Islamist groups that were helped by Israel, by the way. So it's also very interesting that when we had this Hamas, or let's say Palestinian offensive in October 2023, uh, some people, especially in Europe, compared the Hamas to the Islamic State. In fact, these are totally different. I mean, you may consider them as Islamists, but the roots of their Islamism is totally different. And even the Islamic State considered Hamas as an enemy. And therefore, that explains why Israel maintained very good relationships with the Islamist groups in Syria, because in fact they have a common enemy. Again, this is the Syrian state, and the Hamas. To come back to this question, the Hamas was considered by the Syrian Islamists, and namely the Islamic State. Hamas was not considered as a real Islamist because they were fighting for a territory, and a good Islamist should fight for God, for the religion. So this is very interesting, because here we see a total different understanding of what is Islamism, what is used for, and what is the pretext for. And this is why Israel, in fact, supported these groups. And I mentioned the Ukrainian, US intelligence, and French, but in fact, it was also mention of the Israeli intelligence to help those Islamists in the Idlib pocket. So we are in a situation where obviously there is, let's say, an idea of weakening Syria in order to weaken uh, Hezbollah, and at the same time weakening Russia and weakening the influence of Iran, because Syria is at the crossroad of all these influences, if you want. And therefore, that's the reason why there is so much interest in the West at weakening Syria. And it's interesting because the father of, I mean, we could define the father of Bashar al-Assad, I mean, Hafez al-Assad, as a dictator. And that was probably in the 70s, 80s. That was the time when you could have some kind of regime. But Bashar al-Assad was very different in essence, because first of all, is someone who didn't want to be in the power. His elder brother should have been, in fact, the successor of Hafez al-Assad. But since his brother died in a car incident, if I'm not wrong, Bashar al-Assad had to step in. But in fact, he was not very enthusiastic. He's a doctor by profession, and he's not a politician. And he was more or less forced into this role. And I, in my view, I mean, I have a hard time to consider him as a dictator, to be honest. I've never lived in Syria. I don't know how it is, and it may not. It may well be that Syria is not exactly like Switzerland. I can perfectly understand that, but at the same time, I am not sure that Bashar al-Assad is the ruthless dictator that we tend to portray in the West. Let's put it that way. And had Syria less sanctions and all that, probably that Syria would be a totally different type of country. Also, remember that a lot of Islamists that were fighting in Iraq after the US invasion took refuge in Syria. And in fact, they were the destabilizing factor of the Syrian state. Because, and again, when we talk about the what happened in the between 2011 and 2017 or so, uh, it was it was an uprising led by Salafists. And again, this is not my invention, but there was a report written by the DIA in August 2012, 2012, sorry. And in this report, has become famous because in this report, the IA explains the opportunity of creating a Salafi state in Syria. And that's exactly the place where the Islamic State developed itself in the 2015, 2016 or so. But interestingly enough, in this report, it's acknowledged that the uprising is not a democratic opposition. It is a Salafist, strongly Islamist, jihadi type of opposition. And of course, that is a byproduct of the Iraqi war, because all these Islamists that flew out of Iraq went into Syria and destabilized the country. And now we are back to this point, in fact, we are still in this situation that this US invasion of Iraq completely destabilized the region. And we have now these kind of new waves of violence that are in fact the result of what the US has done in about 20 years ago. And it's probably not finished. So um, this is a situation where Syria, because of its geographic position, is affected by both the conflict between the Kurds and Turkey. And we have exactly this problem today, that even the Kurds tend to support the Syrian government against the, again, alleged Turkish supported invasion or attack. But you have this conflict between the Turks and the Kurds. You have the conflict between Israel and the Hezbollah, the conflict between Israel and Syria, and the conflict between Israel and Iran. So, and if you look at the geometrical center of gravity, not the strategic one, but the geographical or geometrical center of gravity, you find Syria. So this is why Syria is at the crossroad of all these conflicts. Most of them having been created, as I said, by the US by its invasion in Iraq in 2003, but also because Israel has a constant policy of aggression against its neighbors, and namely South Lebanon, but also Syria, because you have regular bombing, and not just since October 2023, but you have a regular bombing from Israel against Syrian forces, or whatever forces you have in Syria. So Israel maintains this kind of pressure. We have the US, of course, has also its policy of maximal pressure against Iran, and so we have Syria just in the center of all that. And in addition to that, instead of having a strong government that is able to protect itself and keep some kind of stability in the region, the Western sanctions are weakening this country, making it vulnerable to all kind of influence from Islamists, from jihadists, and all that. And that's, by the way, in 2015, is the reason why Russia had to step in. Because, and that was also acknowledged by the John Kerry, who used to be responsible for foreign affairs of the Obama administration. He confessed that the West, in fact, promoted the development of the Islamic State with the idea that the Islamic State would change the government in Damascus, and and that's the reason why, as the Islamic State reached Palmyra in September 2015, that's the point when the Russians decided to intervene in support of the Syrian government at the request of the Syrian government. It's also important to say. So we have a situation which is extremely complex, that at the origin of which you have both, I mean, you have the West at large, that means Israel and the US. And the other Western countries have not contributed to any stabilization of the situation. On the contrary, they have contributed to worsening the situation, and that's exactly what we are witnessing today.
With what we've seen in the southern Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah, how did you find the role of the Syrian government in helping Hezbollah? Maybe they're thinking that Syria is a key for their fight in Lebanon. If they can overthrow the government in Syria, they can easily defeat Hezbollah. How do you see it? Is that in the mind of Israelis?
Well, yeah, Hezbollah is, in fact, I mean, first of all, Lebanon is surrounded by Syria, meaning that if there is some kind of weaponry coming from Iran or elsewhere in the world, it has somehow to go through Syria. That's the way the Israelis see that. And instead of having good relations with Syria, that could prevent I mean, that could not prevent, but probably a government that could help in containing the Hezbollah. The Israel has antagonized both Lebanon, the population of Lebanon, because the population is probably not in majority Shia, but still, because Israel is attacking Lebanon constantly, people tend to side with the Shia minority. And that's exactly what happened in Syria as well. Again, a policy based on excessive violence in order to use kind of a deterrence based on fear is not a situation that can help stabilize the situation. And Israel has not understood that yet. Um, I have many times explained the difference between the Swiss approach to national security and the Israeli one. But again, I think Israel is making, since 80 years, a mistake by trying to confront its neighbors instead of trying to develop good relations with them. And that's the key. That's the key of the whole issue. But again, that will be very difficult for Israel because it started by, in fact, violating a UN resolution, the resolution 181, that offered the opportunity to create a Jewish state, but not by force, but democratically by using referendums and things like that. But the Israelis at that time, or Jews at that time, because that's before Israel was created, but the Jews didn't take that opportunity and engaged from the very beginning into an aggressive posture against their neighbors. And therefore, now it's very difficult to go backwards. Although I'm sure that from the Arab side, it would be better accepted than from the Israeli side, and even the Western side, by the way. But the Israelis have more problem going backwards, or let's say to engage a reverse gear, than the Arabs. And that explains why we are in a situation that can only end in a disaster. And probably, as some have suggested, including myself, the risk of having Israel disappearing, because there is a point where you have to balance your interests. And and again, if the Israeli state had a more balanced approach, a more, let's say, friendly approach, I'm convinced the other countries would certainly accept. But the problem is that it's not in the mind of the Israelis. They have not, and that's very, by the way, it's a paradox, because they claim to be part of this part of the world since 2000 years, but in reality they don't have the mentality of that region. They have a complete, and not even a European mentality, it's an Eastern mentality, an Eastern European mentality. They have the mentality, exactly the same mentality as you see in Poland, in Ukraine, kind of extremist type of behavior, with the idea that the violence could bring solutions. And um, and that's the probably the problem, because this region is not inherently violent. The violence has come from the destabilization brought in the region by the Westerners. The last one was, I mean, one of the last ones was the invasion of Iraq, as I said. So this is a little bit the problem, and why it's very hard to identify a solution in this conflict, because there is no sign from the Israelis to look for an appeasement. And they don't want to have an appeasement, because they feel that they can survive only with the military support of the West. And by the way, they still have this idea of a grand Israel that would extend from the Nile River to the Euphrates. And with that in mind, it's very hard to understand how they could achieve peace with their neighbors if their basic idea is to invade them. So we are kind of a, it's a paradox in itself. Um, so this is how I see the situation. And this is unfortunate for Syria, because I'm sure this is a country that has a lot of potential. There's a huge history, and that's where you have still the oldest Christian communities in this country. But apparently, the West is still pressing the all the Islamist forces to destabilize this country. It's again, we are, I'm not seeing here the expression of a Western interest. I see more the expression of an Israeli interest that use or exploits the naivety of the Western opinion and the Western governments. That's the how I see that.
Colonel, you've mentioned the conflict in Ukraine and how is that conflict related to what's going on in Syria. In your opinion, right now in Ukraine, how do you find it? How do you find the battleground? Is the Ukrainian army? We've learned that it seems that many intelligence were leaked to the Russians recently by Ukrainian army, but the people who were involved in the Ukrainian army. How do you see? And on the other hand, we've learned that Jake Sullivan was talking about they're gonna put Ukraine in a position to continue the conflict even in the aftermath of Donald Trump's presidency. But at the end of the day, what's going on in Ukraine and how does the West see the conflict right now?
Well, we are still in the same dynamics. So that means the West is fighting Russia up to the last Ukrainian. We're exactly in this scheme, and there is no sign that Ukraine can achieve some kind of victory, which, by the way, has not yet been defined. What could be a defeat of Ukraine? I mean, this is uh, we have no idea of that. At the same time, the Russians uh, they are playing with time because time runs in their favor. So they are slowly but surely crushing the Ukrainian army, and there will be a point where you will have no army at all. That's probably the reason why you have this idea of deploying 100,000 peacekeepers in Ukraine. Um, the thing is that when we talk about peacekeepers, and I remind you that I used to be head of the doctrine, Palestinian doctrine in the UN for peacekeeping operations, and but peacekeepers, as the name says, is someone who keeps the peace, meaning that before deploying peacekeepers, you need to have a peace. And a peace, by definition, must be agreed by both sides. Otherwise, you try to enforce peace. But enforcing peace is, in fact, making war. So the West is in a kind of dilemma here. And this is, I think, the Russians again have said they are ready to talk, but the discussions have to happen on a realistic base. Remember that had the talks in Istanbul, if we had achieved a success, if they had been successful, Ukraine would be empty of Russian troops today. And probably you would have with the issue of Crimea, and probably the two republics in Donetsk and Lugansk, which probably would be still under discussion, but the rest of Ukraine would be peaceful, and you would have no Russian troops in Ukraine. And that's exactly what Zelensky refused by refusing the agreement. So we see that the Russians didn't want to occupy Ukraine. They were ready to give up the territories they conquered in exchange of guarantees for the Russian minorities and the issue of the kind of neutrality of Ukraine. But the West and Western powers, including, of course, Ukraine itself, refused that. So we are now in a situation where the Russians said, well, you had the opportunity to have a peace agreement, you had the opportunity to have us leaving the country, but you refused that. So what's next? And therefore, we see on the Western side, because there is still this idea that we cannot negotiate with Putin, Therefore, we continue war. But continuing war means destroying Ukraine. And now everybody understands that. And that makes, in fact, this idea of non negotiation with uh, Russia extremely cynical from the Europeans, because they know that there is no way they can achieve some kind of victory. And that's probably why they need to extend Russia and try to attack Russia on a variety of fronts, including Syria, for instance. But in Ukraine, I don't know exactly how Western governments understand or see the end of that conflict. Because if I look at how things happen on the ground, on the best case, that will just end with the destruction, the complete destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces. And in the worst case, it will end with the complete destruction of Ukraine. So I don't understand exactly what the Western government are aiming at, because I don't see any opportunity to find a kind of negotiation. And when we talk about negotiations of as Zelensky mentioned, he doesn't mean real negotiations, because for him it's clear that negotiations must be based on, in fact, what they had 2 years ago, you know, and more than 2 years, almost 3 years ago, and not on the reality of the ground today. He doesn't want to acknowledge, I mean, Zelensky doesn't want to acknowledge that he refused a situation in which Ukraine would be much better off today.
Colonel, how about Europe right now? Do you think that the European countries or that kind of mindset of the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine, or they're just reconsidering their policy in Ukraine?
Well, it's a good question. We see more and more moves, and probably the fact that you have a new president in the U.S. with a new approach to conflict will may have an influence on the way the rest of the Europeans understand a possible way out. The fact of the matter is that, to my knowledge, nobody in the West has a real exit strategy for this conflict. As in many conflict, by the way, it was the same in Afghanistan. It was the same in Iraq. I mean, you start a conflict without knowing how you will end that conflict. In Libya was exactly the same. Syria was exactly the same. So the West is pressing and pushing forces into conflict, but they don't know how to end that conflict. And we have exactly the same thing in Ukraine. But that's a weakness, an intellectual weakness, not only from the government, by the way, but also from the security establishment, including the intelligence services. We see that the intelligence services in the West have constantly underestimated the capabilities of the Russians. So they have basically contributed to create a situation in which there was no solution, and that's extremely concerning, because it means those who are supposed to understand the situation were not able to understand it, and they have led this government into situations that are today completely, I mean, almost not manageable anymore. I mean, unless you have a decisive victory from Russia, and then everything would be solved. But then, even then, admitting we have a decisive victory from Russia, what's next? We don't even know. Are we talking to Russia? Are we finding the terms of that, of the Ukrainian defeat will be discussed with whom, and all that. There is no. We have cut all diplomatic ties with Russia. We wanted to isolate Russia because it was considered as a way to defeat Russia. And therefore, isolating it economically, financially, politically, and so on was a way to defeat Russia. And everything of that has failed. And now Russia is obviously in the way of winning this war. Even if we don't know exactly what winning, even for Russia, means. You know, you may have just a political victory, you may have just a military victory, or you may have a complete victory by the total destruction of everything in Ukraine. We don't know exactly how far this could go, but there is not much doubt that Russia is winning today. And I think everybody understands that. Everybody that has some understanding of the conflict acknowledge that. So we are in a situation where we know that Ukraine is winning. We know, therefore, that we know that Russia is winning. We know that Ukraine is being defeated, but we don't know how we will manage this situation. So it's a very strange situation, but that underlines the weakness of our leadership once more, and that in fact also shows the rest of the world how unreliable the West, and include especially the Europeans, are, because at least you could say the US has an idea of how to solve the conflict. Whether this idea is good or not, it's another question, but at least they try to think about it. While on the European side, you have absolutely nothing. There's absolutely no thinking whatsoever about how this conflict should end. You may agree with Trump or with his approach to the conflict or not. But at least he has one. At least he tries to have one, and that's probably why he has an edge if we compare to the Europeans. But the Europeans have absolutely no idea how this conflict could evolve, and that's extremely worrisome if you think about it. So again, I don't know. Maybe next year we'll provide more answers to this question. But as if things are as they are going, we are moving towards a decisive victory of Russia, because even the plan, or so-called plan, that has been mentioned in the press with Keith Kellogg, the new envoy, special envoy for Ukraine, nominated by Donald Trump. I'm not sure this view, because it's more a view than a plan, but I'm not sure this view or this approach is realistic or based on the actual situation on the ground. It's more an intellectual vision that probably someone could have 2 years ago. But today, the reality of the ground seems to go beyond this kind of plan. So, how does General Kellogg uh, consider moving ahead with this kind of plan? I don't know. And that begs another question, because, yes, at least the Trump or the future Trump administration tries to have an idea how to solve the conflict. But the next question is this approach realistic? Does it match the reality on the ground? Because as I have seen so far, we see that you have a lot of plans and ideas, and there were several aspects of this Kellogg plan, or Kellogg idea more than plan, that was reflected in the media. But nobody talks about what is the Russian position on that, you know? And at the end of the day, you cannot ignore that the Russians are those who are winning. That means that somehow the any solution that will be brought for Ukraine has to take into account the view of the Russians. But when I look at what we have now in the media, and even in with Kellogg and all that, I've no sign that there is some consideration for the Russian view. So I have absolutely no, let's say, I cannot envisage any concrete solution with what we have now at hand to make it, to assess the possible end of the conflict, because basically we have those who want to solve the conflict are not even addressing the concerns of the winning party. So how does it I mean, again, that seems extremely extraordinary to me, that we are not considering. I mean, you could ignore the Russians if the Russians would be almost defeated and they had no um, capabilities to respond. And we have seen very recently with the Oreshnik episode and all that, that the Russians have, in fact, not just a superiority on the ground, but also a strategic superiority against the West by the capability of striking the West with conventional weapons, while the West can only answer with nuclear weapons, which makes the whole situation in favor of the Russians. So we see that the situation of the West seems to be weakened every day. It seems more weakened, and still we are not even considering the Russian position when we talk about a possible solution to the conflict. So
Kamal, just to wrap up this session, do you think these people who are going to work with Donald Trump, and the way you mentioned Keith Kellogg, and he was going to be Trump's envoy in Ukraine, in what's going on between Ukraine and Russia. And we've seen the manner of uh, his manner toward the conflict in Ukraine, as we saw on Fox News. He was talking about sending more weapons. If the Biden administration would send more weapons to Ukraine, that would put Donald Trump in a better position to negotiate with Russia. This is the same kind of mindset that we've seen in the Biden administration. Do you think these people, we have a lot of people in this administration who are totally against Russia, and they consider Russia an ultimate enemy of the United States. Do you think these people are helping Donald Trump in achieving his goal in the conflict in Ukraine, or they're gonna make some sort of problems for him?
well, it's a good question. The fact of the matter is that in Europe, it's very interesting. As Trump was elected, you could see all the right wing parties saying, "Oh, that's good, Trump is elected," and we tend to see, especially in Europe, in Western Europe, we tend to see a Trump versus Biden or Kamala Harris as a kind of a right left conflict, and that because in France, for instance, it's exactly what happens when the left is in power, they do something. When the right come to the power, they just make exactly the opposite. And this is just like in the kindergarten. Um, when it comes to foreign policy and national security in the US, we don't see exactly the same kind of scheme. It's not exactly left against right. Probably on the domestic policy side, it's that way, but not in the foreign policy. On the foreign policy, you see kind of a convergence. Probably there maybe some a slight difference in the approach, but in essence, we are talking about the same kind of objectives. And when we talk about China, Russia, um, or even trade war to some extent, we see that it's bipartisan, as the US like to call this. So it's bipartisan. As a result, I'm not the one who expects a lot of difference between Trump and Joe Biden. Probably in the approach, because, for instance, Trump will want to develop a U.S. power from the inside rather than from the outside, and therefore he understands that spending a lot of money and on wars that bring nothing is just a waste of money, and therefore it's better to invest that somewhere else. But it's not that he's against war, he's just against the misuse of money, if I can put it in a different way. As a result, we have seen, by the way, many people he has nominated for his government who are so-called neocons, or people who are very hardliners in when it comes to China, Russia, um, Israel, or Palestinians. This is, or Iran. You don't see much difference, probably in some details, and that's a constant in U.S. Foreign policy. As a result, I don't know exactly how Kellogg will be able to achieve what he wants to do with Russia, and I'm not sure exactly how his relations, personal relation with Donald Trump, will allow to have his view prevailing over the one of Donald Trump. I have no idea, but I would suggest that it would be wrong to assume that the will witness a total change in approach towards Russia. I'm not sure. Donald Trump is the president that during his first mandate was the president who applied the most sanctions and measures against Russia than all the previous presidents. So he's not someone who likes Russia. He just considers that there are other priorities than fighting Russia. This is probably how we should see it. But and if he wants to stop the war in Ukraine, it's not because he wants to favor Russia, or because he doesn't like Ukraine. It's simply because he thinks that it's a waste of money. Russia has won, and we have to take the things from there. So it's a very pragmatic approach to the conflict. Um, as a result, I don't expect to have major changes in in these conflicts. We probably have a different approach to the conflict, but the containment of Russia will probably not stop, and the containment of China neither. So we will continue on these lines. And the vision that Kellogg had to bring more weapons, that might continue. I mean, providing weapons is not. I mean, if you read what the policy of Donald Trump might be in the future, we see that it's still based on a very strong military, and it's still based on an approach based on the use of force. So there is not many changes. The way of applying force may change. He probably will favor sanctions and embargoes and things like that, rather than using military force. But at the end, we still have coercion to achieve objectives. And coercion is exactly what we don't want to have anymore. And that's the reason why you have the development of BRICS and all that, is to escape this coercive approach to foreign policy and the US national security. So I don't know exactly how this will end, but regardless of the nitty gritty of the discussions, it something very basic must be understood. The US or Trump will not achieve any result if he ignores the terms of Russia. This is simply a fact. If we wanted to have a Ukraine independent and let's say away from Russia influence, we should have accepted the Minsk agreements, you know, and that was very much in the scope of what Donald Trump was could have done in his first mandate, but he didn't. And again, we always tend to take the conflict from the point we like, but in reality, we should always go to the root causes. And the root causes of the conflict here, the intervention, the Russian intervention, because there are different layers of this conflict. There's obviously the grand strategy layer with the NATO coming closer to the Russian border. That's the part that Russia has always considered to be a diplomatic issue, not a military issue. What has led to the military intervention of the special military operation in February 2022 is the problem of the Russian minority in Donbass. That's the reason. That's the reason for the Russian intervention. Had the West solved this problem by applying the Minsk agreements, you would have had no intervention. Probably you still would still have the problem of NATO, but that's something the Russians tried to solve, and yes, they tried to solve it diplomatically. And the intervention will provide them a new tool or a new way to achieve their objective by probably using the NATO issue into any kind of peace agreement with Ukraine. But that was not the initial plan of Russians. Again, they tried to have a diplomatic solution to that problem. Now we have given them a new way to solve the problem by, let's say, pressing them to intervene physically and militarily in Ukraine. And that's, I think, this mechanic dimension should be understood. And again, the fact that we didn't make any effort to have the Minsk agreement applied before 2022 is the reason why we are in the situation today and why Ukraine is in this situation today. There's no other reason.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Colonel, for being with us today. Great
That,
pleasure as always.
that was my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.